The morning fog had not yet lifted when Nora Calloway first stood at the gate of the old Hessler farmhouse and truly understood what her mother had left her. The iron latch was rusted so completely it had fused with the post, leaving a dark orange stain running down to the ground like a dried wound. The gate itself hung at a broken angle, one hinge gone, the other barely holding against the weight of warped, waterlogged wood that had swelled and contracted through too many seasons without anyone to care about the difference. Beyond it, what had once been a gravel path was now little more than a suggestion beneath thick mats of weeds and wild grass, rising knee-high in some places, swallowing the earth as though the land had made up its mind long ago to take this place back, piece by piece, without apology or hurry. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She stood there for a long moment in the gray October cold, her breath rising in slow white ribbons that dissolved before they got very far, her hands stuffed into the pockets of a jacket that had been warm once, years ago, before too many winters and not enough replacements had worn the lining thin. The cold came in through the collar and the cuffs, and she let it. She had learned in the past 3 years not to fight discomforts that were not going anywhere. Behind her, her car idled at the side of County Road 9, its exhaust curling upward into the quiet morning air in a small, patient column. Through the rear window, she could see the silhouettes of her 2 children in the back seat, watching her with the wide, unblinking patience that children reserve for the moments they sense are bigger than they have been told. The farmhouse sat at the end of that overgrown path, roughly 300 feet from where she stood, half hidden behind a stand of oak trees whose branches had gone ungoverned for so long they had begun to reach toward one another overhead, forming a canopy that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, in a different season, with different eyes. The structure itself was 2 stories, or had been once. The upper right corner of the roof had partially collapsed inward, leaving a jagged dark wound open to whatever weather chose to enter. The clapboard siding had lost most of its paint, and what remained was the color of old bone, peeling in long curling strips that moved weakly in the morning breeze as though they were trying to signal something. 3 windows she could see from the gate were broken completely, their frames raw and splintered. A 4th had been covered from the inside with a sheet of plywood so old it had split down the center and bowed outward like a chest trying to breathe. She had not been to this property in almost 30 years. The last time Nora had stood anywhere near the Hessler farmhouse, she had been 13 years old, and it had still seemed like something that could be brought back with effort and love. Her mother had driven her out here on a Sunday afternoon in late summer, the 2 of them alone, Richard and Sandra having declined to come for reasons Nora could no longer remember. Elsa had parked the car along the road, and they had walked the path together, her mother moving through the overgrowth with a familiarity that suggested she had been doing this for years, that these visits were a private habit she had never made into a point of family conversation. The farmhouse had been neglected even then, but it had still carried the ghost of what it had once been. There had been curtains visible through 2 of the downstairs windows. The bell above the porch door had still hung on its hook, and when the wind moved through, it made a small, faint sound. Her mother had stood on the porch for a long time and looked out across the 11 acres of land stretching behind the house, the fields that had once been farmed and were by then going back to meadow, and she had said something that Nora had not fully understood at the time. She had said that the best things were often the ones nobody else wanted. Now, standing in the October fog with everything she owned packed into 2 bags in a borrowed pickup truck and 43 years of living pressing down on her shoulders, Nora saw the farmhouse for what it was. A ruin. A test. A question she had not asked for and could not yet answer. She exhaled slowly and reached for the gate. To understand why Nora Calloway was standing at that gate on a cold October morning with less than $50 in her purse and her children watching from the back seat, you had to go back further than the reading of the will. You had to go back to the beginning of the year her mother got sick, and further still to the kind of family the Calloways had always been beneath the surface of Sunday dinners and Christmas photographs. Elsa Calloway had been a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity. She had grown up with very little in a farmhouse not unlike the one at the end of the overgrown path, raised by parents who measured prosperity in livestock and harvests, and in the discipline of showing up every morning to the work in front of you regardless of how you felt about it. She had left that life when she married, moved to town, built something that looked from the outside like stability. The house on Meredith Street, a wide two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that Elsa had tended every spring with a devotion usually reserved for prayer, was the physical proof of that stability. It was the kind of house that people drove past and recognized as belonging to someone who had done things right. What they did not see was the cost. What they could not see was that the stability had been constructed not just from hard work, but from a particular kind of self-erasure, the quiet, ongoing sacrifice of the woman inside. The house in service of the impression the house made on the world outside it. Elsa had 3 children. The oldest was Richard, 51, who had become a commercial real estate developer and lived in a house twice the size of his mother's with a wife named Patricia who had never, in all the years Nora had known her, offered to help carry anything that wasn't hers. Richard was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned early that attention went to the people who moved quickly and with confidence, and he had spent 30 years perfecting both. He called on birthdays. He sent expensive gifts. He arrived at family events with the charged energy of someone who has come a long way and intends everyone to know it. Sandra was 48, an attorney in a city 4 hours away, composed and precise in a manner that had started as professional necessity and over the years had become simply who she was. She visited twice a year and always brought the right thing. She asked the right questions and remembered the details from previous conversations in a way that felt attentive until you realized that the questions never led anywhere deeper. She was present in all the ways that could be observed and absent in all the ways that could not. And then there was Nora, the youngest, 43, who had stayed. She had not stayed because she had nowhere else to go, though as the years passed it sometimes looked that way from the outside. She had stayed because she had understood, in the way some people simply understand things without being able to explain it, that her mother was going to need someone. It had started small, dropping by more often, helping with the garden when Elsa's arthritis made kneeling painful, accompanying her to the doctor for appointments that Elsa had been attending alone for too long. Then the arthritis had become something else, a slow compounding of conditions that the doctors described with the calm vocabulary of people who have witnessed the same decline many times, and the small ways Nora helped had expanded into something that structured her entire life. She had been there for the appointments, the prescriptions, the phone calls to insurance companies that lasted 45 minutes and resolved nothing. She had been there on the nights when her mother could not sleep for the pain and needed someone to sit with her in the kitchen and talk about nothing until the dark began to thin at the windows. She had held Elsa's hand through procedures and setbacks, and one particularly frightening October when no one had known for 10 days whether the news would be recoverable or not. She had done all of this while working part-time as a bookkeeper for a small family business that paid her just enough to almost cover the bills. She had done it while raising Maya and Lucas largely on her own, their father having departed when Lucas was barely 2 years old, leaving behind a note and an apology that didn't come close to covering what it needed to cover. She had done it without asking Richard or Sandra to do more than they did, because asking felt like a kind of failure she was not willing to claim. When Richard asked, on his visits, how things were going, she said fine. When Sandra sent her careful emails checking in, she replied with the manageable version of events. She had not kept score. She had not cataloged her sacrifices or presented them as claims. She had simply shown up, every day, because it needed doing and she was there. What she had quietly assumed in the way people assume things when they do not want to examine their assumptions too closely, was that this would be accounted for in some way when the time came. Elsa Calloway died on a Thursday morning in late January, peacefully, in the room she had slept in for 40 years, with Nora beside her holding her hand, the winter light coming in gray and thin through the curtains, the house around them very still. Nora sat there for a while after, not quite ready to make the calls that would set everything in motion, wanting a few more minutes of the particular quiet that still felt like her mother's presence before it became something else. Richard and Sandra arrived within 48 hours. They did not come to grieve together, exactly. They came organized. Richard had a folder. Sandra had a legal pad. They moved through the house on Meredith Street with the efficient purpose of people who have already begun, mentally, to close this chapter and prepare for the administrative reality that followed it. And Nora understood that this was how they processed grief by doing, by managing, by converting the unbearable into the procedural. The word estate appeared almost immediately. The estate. Settling the estate. Managing the estate. As though everything their mother had built and loved and tended for 40 years could be cleanly filed under a single administrative category and processed without remainder. Harold Pettigrew's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and heated air. Pettigrew had handled Elsa's affairs for over 20 years and delivered his information with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that what seemed procedural to him was earthquake level for the people across his desk. The will was clear and relatively simple. The house on Meredith Street, the savings account, the car, and the personal property within the home were to be divided equally among the 3 children. There were minor specific bequests to a few people and a charitable organization their mother had supported for decades. Richard nodded through the reading with the expression of someone confirming figures already calculated internally. Sandra made small notes. Nora sat quietly and felt the shape of her grief pressing against the inside of her chest like something trapped, looking for a way out through a space that was not quite large enough. When Pettigrew finished, there was a brief silence that Richard moved into almost immediately. "The house," he said. "We should probably talk about liquidating. The market is solid right now." Sandra agreed. Nora said nothing. She had not yet thought concretely beyond the next hour, because the hour after that felt like standing at the edge of something she could not see the bottom of. The equal division was not wrong. She understood the logic of it, could see the fairness in it from the outside, but the practical mathematics were stark and did not account for the ways the past 4 years had been arranged. After the estate was divided 3 ways and the most urgent of her debts addressed, she would be standing in approximately the same place she stood now, only without her mother and without the structure that the caregiving role had quietly given to her days. The house sold in 11 days. Richard managed it. Sandra reviewed the contracts. Nora signed where she was asked and tried not to think about the kitchen where she had learned to cook, the garden her mother had knelt in every spring, the specific creak of the 3rd step from the top of the staircase she had navigated in the dark so many times she could have found it blindfolded. She received her share of the proceeds 6 weeks after closing. She paid off the most pressing debts. She moved Maya and Lucas into a smaller apartment. She counted what remained and understood that if she was careful, it would last approximately 8 months. 8 months to figure out what came next. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 11 weeks after the first will reading, Harold Pettigrew called her. He had become aware, he explained with careful precision, of a second document. Not a codicil added to the existing will, but a separate and complete one, drawn up 4 years earlier by a notary in the next county, a woman named Gertrude Moss, now retired and filed separately from the primary estate documents. It had come to Pettigrew's attention through a letter delivered to his office by the notary's successor, acting on instructions left by Gertrude Moss herself. Time to be sent a specific number of months after Elsa Calloway's death. Nora was sitting at her kitchen table with Maya's homework spread in front of her. She did not move. The second will, Pettigrew continued, pertained to a single piece of property not mentioned in the primary estate because it had been removed from the estate before the primary will was written. The old Hessler farmhouse on County Road 9, along with 11 acres of surrounding land, had been transferred by Elsa Calloway into a separate trust 4 years prior to her death. The trust named a single beneficiary. Nora asked him to repeat that part. He did. Her name. Her full legal name. Nora Jean Calloway. The sole beneficiary of the Hessler farmhouse and its 11 acres. She asked him why. She knew he could not answer this, but asked it anyway, the question arriving before she could consider whether it was useful. Pettigrew was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Elsa had left a personal letter addressed to Nora, sealed and attached to the trust documents. He had not read it. He would include it with the paperwork. She drove to his office the following morning and sat in the same chair she had sat in for the first reading. The folder Pettigrew placed before her was thin. She opened the letter first, her fingers unsteady in a way she could not entirely control. Elsa had written it by hand, and the handwriting was the version from 4 years prior, still controlled and elegant, before the illness had made writing difficult. The pen pressure was steady and even, the letters formed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this document would be read in their absence and wanted the reading to feel, as much as possible, like a presence. 2 pages, front and back, on the lightweight cream stationery Elsa had kept in the right-hand drawer of her writing desk for as long as Nora could remember. The letter did not begin with an explanation. It began with her name, simply and directly. Nora. As though Elsa was starting a conversation across an interval she had known would come. She wrote about the farmhouse. She wrote that she had held on to it for all these years, never sold it, never formally mentioned it in family discussions about property, never brought it up at holiday dinners when the subject of the estate occasionally surfaced, because she had always believed that the right time would reveal itself and the right person would need it. She wrote that she had watched her youngest daughter for 43 years with the particular attention of someone who understood what it cost to be the one who stayed, who showed up without being asked, who absorbed the weight others set down and walked away from. She wrote that she had tried to make this accounting in the primary will and had found that she could not do it fairly within those constraints without creating a conflict that would outlast her. So she had done it separately, quietly, in a way that would become known when it needed to become known. She wrote that the farmhouse needed work. She was honest about this with an almost wry directness that was so completely her mother's voice that Nora had to stop reading twice to let the grief move through her before she could continue. The roof, Elsa wrote, is not what it was. The heating is uncertain. The path has been unmaintained for years, and the garden is well beyond what I can call a garden any longer. She wrote that she was not leaving her daughter a finished thing, but a beginning. She wrote that the land surrounding it was good land, that she believed in what good land could hold. She wrote that she had hidden something there, and that when Nora was ready, when she had lived in the place long enough to feel the shape of it, she would find what her mother had placed there for her. The letter ended the way it had begun, simply and directly, with the particular kind of love that does not perform itself. Nora sat in Harold Pettigrew's office for a long time after she finished reading. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She called Richard that evening. She told him about the farmhouse, about the second will, about the trust filed quietly in a county office 4 years before any of them had begun thinking about estates and divisions. There was a silence that she could feel the temperature of. Then he said, "Are you serious?" She said yes. He said he would need to look into this. He used the word contested without quite finishing the thought, and she heard everything he meant by it. His voice was not angry in the way of someone who has been robbed. It was the anger of someone who has arranged a picture carefully in their mind, and then been shown that the picture was missing a significant portion. Sandra called 30 minutes later, her voice more composed than Richard's, which was in some ways harder to receive. She said she was glad Nora had something. She said she hoped it worked out. She said she assumed the property needed considerable work and that of course they were both available if Nora needed guidance. The word guidance arrived with a weight that Sandra almost certainly did not intend, but Nora felt every ounce of it. In the weeks that followed, as the trust was confirmed and the county records verified and Harold Pettigrew determined that the document was clean and the conveyance complete, the temperature in the family changed in ways that were small but unmistakable. Richard's Sunday calls stopped. Sandra's emails became shorter and spaced further apart. At a family gathering in April that Nora attended with Maya and Lucas, she noticed the way conversations shifted when she entered a room. Not dramatically, not with obvious hostility, just with the subtle rearrangement of people who have been talking about something they prefer not to continue in a particular person's presence. A cousin of her mother's said something to her at that gathering that would remain with her. He said it with the benevolent certainty of someone who believes he is being helpful. He said she should think carefully about what she was taking on. That old farmhouse, he said, had been a problem since before she was born. Elsa had held on to it out of sentiment. She always had a sentimental streak. You know how she was, and it had no real value anymore, if it ever had. The roof alone would cost more to fix than the property was worth. She should talk to someone about selling the land, at least. There were developers who looked at that stretch of county road. She might get something for it. She thanked him politely and moved away. She heard variations of this from others. A neighbor who had known the family for decades. A woman at her mother's church. Even one of her bookkeeping clients, who had seen the county record in passing and asked casually what her plans were for the old Hessler place. And when she said she intended to live there for a while, nodded slowly with the particular expression of someone exercising considerable restraint. The consensus was unmistakable. and it arrived from every direction simultaneously. The farmhouse was worthless. Nora was making a mistake. Sentiment was not a plan. The kindest version of the message was that she deserved better than what she had been left. The less kind version, which surfaced in unguarded moments, was that this was exactly what happened when you spent your life being the one who stayed. You ended up with the ruin while everyone else got the real estate. She did not argue. She did not explain. She did not know yet what she was moving toward, only that she was moving toward something, and she understood, in the particular quiet way her mother had understood things, that you did not always get to see the destination before you started walking. Maya asked her one evening, while they washed dishes, whether the farmhouse was really as bad as everyone was saying. Nora thought about how to answer this honestly without tipping into either false reassurance or despair. She said it needed work. She said that some places looked worse than they were from the outside. She said that their grandmother had believed in it, and that counted for something. Maya was quiet for a moment, drying the pot she was holding with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Then she said okay, and went back to work. Lucas appeared in Nora's doorway late that same night, while she was sitting up with Elsa's letter spread on the bed in front of her, going through it again the way you return to a thing you have not yet fully understood. He came in without saying anything and sat next to her and leaned against her shoulder with the specific trust of someone who does not need the situation explained in order to know where they should be. She put the letter away and turned off the light and lay beside him in the dark until his breathing deepened and evened out into sleep. Then she lay there a while longer, in the particular quiet of a decision that has been made without yet being spoken. In the morning, she would call Gerald Briggs about the truck. They moved on a Saturday at the beginning of October, which was not ideal timing given the state of the farmhouse's heating system, but it was when the apartment lease ended and the options for extending it had run dry. Gerald Briggs had offered the use of his pickup truck without making it into anything beyond a practical offer, and he had pressed an envelope into her hand before she drove away and told her to use it for whatever was most urgent. She had opened it in the parking lot and found $800 in 50s and had sat there for 3 full minutes before she felt capable of putting the truck in reverse. She and Gerald loaded the truck in the morning. There was not so much to load. She had kept what was essential and left what was not, which was easier than it sounded because the essential things turned out to be fewer than she had imagined, and leaving the rest behind had felt less like loss and more like setting something down she had been carrying longer than she realized. The children had each packed a bag of their own choosing. Maya's contained primarily books and a journal and the photograph of Elsa that had sat on the shelf in her bedroom since she was small enough to need Nora to lift her up to see it properly. Lucas's contained his collection of small carved wooden animals, birds and deer and a bear and one improbable elephant he had found at a school flea market and loved with a specific devotion, which he carried with the seriousness of someone transporting artifacts. They drove out of the city in the late morning. The October sky above County Road 9 was flat and gray, the fields on either side of the road brown and waiting for something. Nora drove the pickup and let the children have the front seat beside her, Lucas in the middle because he was smaller, and spent the first 20 minutes of the drive with his face turned toward the passing fields, naming the birds he could identify from the window. When they turned off the road and she saw the farmhouse, she stopped the truck and got out and stood at the gate the way she had stood there in her mind 100 times since March, and let the full reality of it settle around her without flinching. The fog from the previous night still clung in low patches across the ground. The oak trees along the path had begun to turn, their leaves moving between green and amber in the reluctant way of things not yet fully committed to change. The farmhouse waited at the end of the path with the particular patience of a structure that has been waiting a very long time and has no reason to assume it will stop waiting anytime soon. Lucas asked, from the window, whether they were there. She told him yes. He looked at the farmhouse for a moment with the careful assessment of someone trying to form an opinion based on limited information. Then he asked whether it was haunted. She told him no. He nodded slowly, looking again at the collapsed corner of the upper roof. She could see him deciding to take her at her word. Maya had said nothing since they turned off the road. She was looking at the oak trees with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided how to say. Then she looked at her mother. Then she looked back at the farmhouse. She said, "It has good trees." Nora looked at the oaks. She said, "Yes, it does." She lifted the gate with both hands and the firm upward pressure it required. and they drove the truck slowly up the overgrown path to the porch. The interior of the farmhouse was both better and worse than Nora had allowed herself to imagine, which was approximately what she had expected. The structure, where she tested it by pressing hard against load-bearing walls and checking where the plaster showed separation from the underlying lath, was more solid than the exterior suggested. Someone had built this place with serious intention. The bones were there beneath the decades of neglect, waiting. The staircase protested at every step, but held without flexing in any way that alarmed her. The kitchen had running water from a well pump, though the pipes shuddered and knocked when she opened the taps, and the water ran brown and silty for almost a full minute before it cleared to something she was willing to look at. The heating was the first crisis. The oil furnace in the basement was an old system with the particular grim solidity of things built before anyone worried about efficiency, and it refused to cooperate on the first day no matter what she tried. She found 3 electric space heaters in a closet at the end of the downstairs hall. 2 worked. The third smelled like it had something to resolve with the past, and she arranged the 2 functioning ones in the kitchen and the room she had chosen for the children. The temperature held at something that was survivable, if not comfortable. She kept her jacket on through the first afternoon. The ground floor offered a large kitchen, a sitting room with a fireplace she would assess later, and a small room off the kitchen that had likely been a study or a secondary pantry and was currently stacked nearly to its ceiling with old furniture, wooden crates, cardboard boxes, and tools in various states of wear and disrepair. The upper floor had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom containing a clawfoot tub she privately thought was the most beautiful object in the building, and a faucet with the same brown water requirement as the kitchen sink. The collapsed section of the roof was above the larger of the 2 small bedrooms. She closed that room off, propping a chair under the handle and making a mental note to address it when the more critical items were handled. The other small bedroom, structurally sound, with 2 intact windows and a floor that only gave slightly in one corner, she gave to the children. The large bedroom she took for herself. That first night, the 3 of them ate dinner sitting on the kitchen floor because there was no table yet, with sandwiches she had brought from the city and hot chocolate she made on the gas stove, which worked perfectly and seemed almost affronted by everything else the house had chosen to let go. Lucas arranged 6 of his wooden animals along the baseboard opposite them: 2 birds, a deer, the elephant, a bear, and a small fox that was missing one ear and which he had always called Victor for reasons he had never explained, and the small assembly watched them eat with the calm authority of appointed witnesses. Maya read by flashlight while she worked through her sandwich. Nora sat with her back against the cabinet and looked at the kitchen wall's old plaster, stained in several places, a crack running diagonally from the upper corner to the floor, and listened to the farmhouse settle and shift around them, the creaks and ticks of an old structure adjusting to a change of season, or perhaps simply to the unfamiliar presence of people after so long without them. She thought about what the letter had said. She had hidden something there. When Nora was ready, when she had lived in the place long enough to feel the shape of it, she would find what her mother had placed there for her. She looked at the crack in the plaster and thought about what kind of patience that required. To place something inside a place and step back and wait. To trust, across whatever distance death creates, that the right hands would eventually arrive to receive it. It struck her, sitting there on the cold kitchen floor with her hot chocolate and her children and the row of wooden animals watching from the baseboard, that this was a specific kind of faith, not the blind faith of someone who hoped for the best. The deliberate, practical faith of a woman who had watched her youngest daughter long enough to know what she was capable of and had made her plans accordingly. Richard and Sandra had received the house on Meredith Street, the garden, the savings, the car, the things that looked like wealth because they were legible as wealth, because they could be divided into a document and assessed by a lawyer and converted into numbers. Nora had received the place no one wanted, the ruin on County Road 9 that a developer had already been circling like something that had not yet understood it was dead. She understood, sitting in that kitchen for the first time, that her mother had seen further than any of them, that she had looked at the farmhouse not as a liability, but as the one thing in her estate that could not simply be converted into thirds and dispersed and forgotten. The one thing that required someone to show up for it the way Nora had always shown up for everything, with her hands and her patience and her refusal to be defeated by the problem in front of her. Elsa had given it to the only one of her children she trusted to receive it properly. The first week was defined almost entirely by work. Nora had never been afraid of work. She had been raised by a woman who regarded the distance between a problem and its solution as something to be walked with your hands, and that inheritance she had kept when others were lost. She began with the basics and moved outward from them in widening rings. She cleared the path from the gate to the porch over 2 days, cutting back weeds and overgrown brush with tools from the closet off the kitchen. She swept and mopped every floor on the ground level, working through years of accumulated grime with the methodical patience of someone who knows that transformation happens incrementally and does not try to rush the increments. She got the oil furnace running on the 3rd day by following a repair tutorial on her phone and replacing a filter that had solidified to the consistency of compressed chalk. When the heat finally began to move through the old iron radiators and the temperature in the kitchen climbed above 50 degrees for the first time, Maya looked up from her book, registered the change, and said, without ceremony, "That's better," as though she had been waiting to offer this assessment until it was warranted. Gerald Briggs came by on the 4th day with a folding table and 4 chairs he said were spares he had no use for, and the presence of that table in the kitchen changed the quality of their evenings in a way that was disproportionate to the object itself. They sat around it for dinner, Lucas with his animals along one edge, Maya with her homework spread across the other, and Nora at her end looking at her children and feeling, beneath the cold and the uncertainty and the long list of things still to be done, something she had not felt in a long time. A sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, even though she could not yet explain why. Ruth Edgars appeared at the gate on the 2nd day with a casserole and the brisk efficiency of someone who has decided on a course of action and is executing it without fanfare. She was 72, had lived down the road her whole life, and had known Elsa Calloway in the peripheral way of neighbors who cross paths at the post office and the grocery store, and the kind of community events that require you to be somewhere without necessarily being required to talk to anyone for long. She had watched the farmhouse sitting empty from her kitchen window for years, she said, and had wondered sometimes what was going to become of it. She looked at Nora with the frank directness of someone who had outlived enough situations to have stopped softening her assessments for courtesy. "You planning to stay?" she asked. Nora said yes. Ruth nodded once, with finality, as though this settled something that had been pending. "Good," she said. Then she handed over the casserole and left without further ceremony. She came back 3 days later with a box of tools she said she no longer used, and a jar of something she called her winter preserves, the label on the jar written in handwriting so decisive and angular it looked like it had been cut rather than written. She stayed 20 minutes this time, and said almost nothing beyond a few observations about the furnace, which she seemed to know about from some prior and unspecified experience, and a comment about the oak trees out front, which she said had been on this property since before either of their mothers was born, and which she delivered with the reverence of someone making a formal introduction. Nora offered her tea. Ruth accepted, sat down at Gerald Briggs's table with the ease of someone who has sat at kitchen tables in various states of disrepair for 7 decades, and found them all equally functional, and looked around the kitchen with a slow, evaluative attention. Then she said, "Elsa used to talk about this place sometimes. Not often. She wasn't a woman who repeated herself, but sometimes." Nora asked what she had said about it. Ruth considered this for a moment, her hands wrapped around the mug. She said that Elsa had always believed there was more to it than people gave it credit for. That was how she said it, Ruth told her. More to it. She never explained what she meant. Ruth had assumed it was sentiment, the kind of attachment you develop to a place you grew up near. She looked at Nora steadily. Maybe it wasn't sentiment, she said. Maybe she just meant it. Then she finished her tea and thanked Nora for it, and said she'd be down the road if anything was needed, and left. A man named Dale Pruitt stopped his truck at the gate one morning while Nora was working on clearing the brush from the south side of the path. He introduced himself, mentioned that he had been keeping an eye on the old Hessler property for a developer client who had expressed interest in the land, said he was sorry to hear it had been willed to someone, and hoped she knew what she was taking on. She said she was beginning to figure it out. He nodded and drove away, and she went back to the brush. By the end of the first week, she had developed a working knowledge of the farmhouse's layout that went beyond the rooms she used and into the building's bones. She had walked every floor multiple times, pressing walls, checking where the plaster showed stress, making notes on what needed immediate attention and what could wait. She had gone to the basement twice, walking its perimeter with a flashlight, mapping the layout. She had climbed the pull-down stair to the attic and assessed the insulation and the state of the roofing boards beneath the deteriorating shingles. She was not a builder, but she had grown up in a house where things needed fixing, and fixing them was something you learned. And she had spent 4 years managing the complex logistics of her mother's care, which had given her a practical competence that did not announce itself, but held up under pressure. It was in the course of this systematic survey that she first noticed something that did not add up. It happened on the 8th day. She was in the small room off the kitchen, the study, or pantry, working to clear it of the stacked furniture and boxes that had been accumulating there for what appeared to be several decades, moving things out piece by piece to the covered porch where she would sort them later. She was thinking, as she worked, about whether to use the room as a place to do her bookkeeping, which she had started taking on again remotely. It was the right size. The light from its single intact window was good in the morning. She had just moved an old oak dresser. Heavy, the kind of furniture made to outlast everyone who owned it when something shifted in her perception of the room. It was not a sound or a sight exactly. It was the sort of thing that happens in the peripheral awareness when the brain has been cataloging a space long enough to notice when something doesn't match. She stopped and stood still and let the feeling surface. It was the back wall. She set the dresser aside and stepped back and looked at the wall more carefully. It appeared, at first glance, identical to the other walls. Old plaster, faintly discolored, one long crack near the left side that ran from the height of the window down to the baseboard. Nothing that demanded attention. She went outside and stood on the porch and looked at the exterior of the farmhouse from the backside. She counted window placements. She measured the approximate depth of the house from the exterior by pacing it. She came back inside and paced the small room from front to back. Then she went to the basement and stood beneath the small room and traced the floor above her with her flashlight. The basement extended 3 feet beyond the apparent back wall of the room above. She stood there for a moment, working through what this meant geometrically. If the basement went 3 feet further than the room's interior suggested, then either that section of the ground floor was dead space, a gap, a crawl void with no accessible room above it, or the room's actual interior dimensions were being understated by something built into the wall. She went back up. She returned to the small room and stood at the back wall. She pressed her palm flat against the plaster, the way she had pressed every other wall in the house. The resistance that came back was slightly different. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Just slightly, toward the right side of the wall, in the way of something that is not entirely what it presents as being. She pressed her ear to the plaster, the way she had once listened through an apartment wall trying to determine where a pipe was leaking. In the farmhouse's particular silence, she could hear it clearly enough. The acoustic quality of the wall beneath her cheek changed when she moved toward the right side. The absence of the returning resonance that solid construction produces. A hollow space, somewhere beyond the plaster. She stepped back. She read the letter again in her mind, the way she had been doing for weeks, one line at a time, without needing the paper in front of her. She had hidden something there. When Nora was ready, when she had lived in the place long enough to feel the shape of it. She crouched down and brushed her fingertips along the base of the back wall, near the right corner, moving slowly from left to right along the baseboard. The plaster here was slightly different in texture, not dramatically, but enough that her fingers registered it. She pressed, and the surface gave, just barely, in a way that solid plaster against solid structure does not. She moved her flashlight closer and aimed it at the base of the wall at an oblique angle that changed the way the shadows fell across the surface. And there it was, faded to near invisibility under years of dust and age-darkened plaster, but visible now, in this light, at this angle, a line, straight and deliberate, following the edge of something installed into the wall and then plastered over with meticulous care. The line ran horizontally along the baseboard for approximately 3 feet, then turned upward at a right angle for what appeared to be another 2 feet before disappearing behind where the dresser had been. Not a crack, not a stain, not a settling seam. A perimeter, the edge of something built into the wall and sealed behind it. Something her mother had known was there. Nora pressed the plaster with her palm at the center of the shape. It gave, very slightly, in a way that was not the give of deteriorated plaster, but the give of something mounted on a surface that could move. She sat back on her heels and let out a slow, controlled breath. In the kitchen behind her, Maya called out to ask if she wanted hot chocolate too. Her voice was easy and unhurried, the voice of a child who has begun to feel at home. Yes, Nora said. Her voice came out steady. She would be right there. She stood and looked at the wall for another long moment. She laid her right hand flat against it one more time, feeling the slight difference in pressure, the faint suggestion of an edge hidden beneath surface, the deliberate concealment of something that had been waiting quietly, patiently, in exactly the way Elsa Calloway had always waited for the right person to come looking. She turned off her flashlight and walked back to the kitchen. Lucas was explaining something to his carved wooden elephant in the focused, low-voiced way he conducted these consultations. Maya had already poured the milk and was watching the pot with the serious attention of someone who has learned not to look away at the critical moment. Gerald Briggs's table stood in the center of the kitchen with the unpretentious solidity of something that simply wanted to be useful. Nora sat down. She wrapped both hands around the mug Maya set in front of her. She looked at her children and felt the particular weight of what she was carrying settle into something she could name. Her mother had left her a beginning, a ruin that was also a question, and inside the question, an answer she had placed with her own hands and trusted to the right moment and the right person. Elsa had known her youngest daughter well enough to know she would not rush, that she would do the work first, that she would clear the path and fix the heat and eat dinner on the floor and map the bones of the place before she started looking for what lay inside them. She had known Nora would find it when she was ready. The October night pressed against the kitchen windows. The radiators ticked and settled. Lucas arranged his animals in their careful line along the edge of the table. Tomorrow morning, before she started anything else, Nora would go back to the wall. She would find the full perimeter of what her mother had built and sealed and hidden there. She would follow it to wherever it led. Whatever Elsa Calloway had placed inside that wall had been waiting for 43 years of her daughter's life to be found. It could wait one more night. She woke at 4:47 in the morning to a silence so complete it had its own texture. The kind of silence particular to a place that has not had people in it for so long that it has half forgotten what to do with the small sounds they make. The bedroom around her was cold despite the radiator, which ticked and knocked with the irregular persistence of something trying its best, but not quite managing. The October night pressing in through the old single-pane windows with the patient force of a season that understands it has the advantage. She lay still for a moment, oriented herself in the dark the way you do in an unfamiliar space, tracing the ceiling with her eyes, counting the shapes the shadows made. Then she remembered the wall, and the memory arrived with a precision that told her she had not really stopped thinking about it, even in sleep. She got up slowly, careful not to wake Maya and Lucas, whose breathing she could hear through the thin shared wall between their room and hers, the soft, even rhythm of children who have moved through the world's strangeness and come out the other side into rest. She pulled on her work clothes in the dark, doing the buttons by feel, and took her flashlight from the nightstand. She did not turn it on until she was in the hall with the door closed behind her. The farmhouse at 5 in the morning had a different quality than it had in the day. The creaks and adjustments of the structure were more audible, the cold more present, the smell of old wood and plaster, and the particular damp earth note of a building that has been holding its breath for a long time more concentrated in the still air. She stood at the top of the staircase for a moment and listened to it. Then she went down. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had told herself the night before that she would approach this methodically, that she would not rush into the wall with a hammer out of impatience the way she wanted to, but would first complete the mapping she had begun the previous afternoon, make sure she understood exactly what she was dealing with before she dealt with it. She had made this decision sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, speaking sensibly to herself in the interior voice she used for situations that required restraint, and she had believed it in the way you believe decisions made before you have tested them against the actual pressure of the thing. Now she stood in the doorway of the small room with her flashlight and felt the patience she had promised herself thinning rapidly in the face of what was behind that wall. She had moved the remaining boxes and furniture to the porch the previous afternoon after the children came home from school, working with a steady urgency she had not entirely been able to explain to herself. The room was clear now. The floorboards ran straight and even to the back wall. The wall itself sat there in the beam of her flashlight exactly as it had the evening before, giving nothing away, maintaining its posture of ordinary plaster with the practiced composure of something that has been keeping a secret for a very long time and has gotten comfortable with the weight of it. She began with measurements. She had bought a tape measure at the hardware store in town the previous Thursday, and she used it now to map the room precisely, writing the numbers in her notebook with the care of someone who needed the record to be accurate enough to trust. The room was 11 feet, 4 inches wide, 14 feet, 2 inches deep, measured from the door to the apparent back wall. She went outside with the tape measure and measured the exterior footprint of the farmhouse from the back, working by flashlight in the dark with the October cold sharpening against her hands, and came back with the exterior dimension for this section of the building, 16 feet, 10 inches. The difference was 2 feet, 8 inches. She stood in the small room and looked at the back wall and understood, with the calm of someone who has been holding a hypothesis long enough that its confirmation feels inevitable rather than surprising, that the wall was not the back of the room. It was a division within the room, a false wall, built with enough skill and patience that no one looking at it casually would have seen it for what it was. The plaster matched. The baseboard ran continuous. The crack that ran from the upper left corner to the floor was real, but positioned with enough naturalness to read as a product of settling rather than construction. Her mother had not plastered over a door or a seam. She had built a wall, or had it built, and behind it, she had created a space measuring, by Nora's calculation, roughly 11 feet wide and 2 feet, 8 inches deep. Not large, but large enough for what Nora was beginning to suspect was there. She crouched at the baseboard where the faint metal edge had revealed itself the previous afternoon. In the flashlight beam, with the room emptied and her eyes fully adjusted to the dark, she could see more than she had seen before. The line was not a single horizontal strip running along the floor. It turned. She traced it with her fingers, following the edge from the right side of the wall across nearly 3 feet of baseboard, then upward at a right angle for approximately 4 feet, then horizontally again. The third side of a rectangle. She pressed along the fourth side and found it running back down to the baseboard, completing the perimeter. A door, 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, set flush with the wall's surface, its metal frame buried beneath a thin coat of plaster applied with enormous care. She pressed her palm flat against the center of the rectangle. It gave slightly, as it had before. The resistance was different from the rest of the wall. Hinged on the left side, she guessed. By the way, the give was marginally greater on the right. She turned back to the room, picked up the wide flat chisel from the tools she had brought down the night before, and crouched again at the baseboard. She was not a person who destroyed things carelessly. Everything she did to this wall she intended to do in a way that left the minimum necessary damage. She set the blade of the chisel along the metal edge at the base of the door's frame and applied firm, even pressure. The plaster gave, reluctantly at first, and then all at once, cracking in a line that ran clean and straight along the frame exactly as she had hoped. She worked methodically, moving the chisel upward along the right edge, then across the top, then down the left side, clearing the plaster in sections that came away in rough flat pieces, exposing the metal frame beneath. The frame was iron, old but solid, dark with age, and sealed where it met the wall with a substance she could not immediately identify, but which smelled, faintly, of linseed oil. When the frame was fully exposed, she found the latch. It was on the right side, as she had guessed, a simple iron bar set into a recessed channel. She lifted it. It moved with more ease than she expected, well-oiled, recently maintained. She pushed the door. It opened inward, and what met her was not the damp and rot she had half prepared for, but cool, dry air with a quality she recognized immediately. She had felt the same quality of air in Harold Pettigrew's document storage room once, years ago, waiting while he retrieved papers. It was the air of a space that had been sealed and climate-managed, protected from the fluctuations that deteriorate things over time. The smell was complex but not unpleasant. Old paper, wood, something mineral, and beneath it, very faintly, the particular scent she associated with her mother's house on cold mornings. A smell she had not been able to name or locate since January. She pushed the door fully open and raised her flashlight. The space behind the false wall was not a crude cavity. It was finished. The walls were lined with cedar boards, fitted tightly, and sealed with a careful attention that suggested someone had taken seriously both the preservation of whatever was stored here and the integrity of the concealment. Along the left wall ran two sets of wooden shelving, deep and solidly bracketed, their surfaces clean beneath a thin film of settled dust. The right wall held two large wooden trunks, flat-topped, their surfaces dark and smooth with age. At the far end of the space, which extended the full 11-foot width of the room and the 2 feet, 8 inches of depth, stood a cabinet. Freestanding, built from a dark hardwood Nora did not immediately recognize, its doors closed. On top of the cabinet, positioned with the deliberateness of something placed rather than left, was an envelope. White, unsealed. Her name was written on the front. Nora. The same handwriting as the first letter, but from a different time. She could tell immediately the pen pressure less controlled, the letters slightly larger, written by a hand dealing with its limitations. From the last year, perhaps. From the last months. She did not open the envelope yet. She made herself look at the room first. She needed to understand what she was standing inside before she read what her mother had written about it. The shelving along the left wall held a collection of objects that her flashlight picked out one by one as she moved it slowly from shelf to shelf. On the top shelf, a row of paintings, small to medium in size, each wrapped carefully in a fabric she identified as acid-free textile, the kind used in professional archival storage. Some wrappings had been labeled in her mother's handwriting with dates and descriptive phrases she could not yet read fully in the flashlight beam. She counted 7 wrapped paintings on that shelf. Below them, a row of carved wooden objects and ceramic pieces, each individually cushioned and fitted foam inserts laid into flat wooden trays. She recognized none of the specific pieces, but the quality of their presentation told her something about how they had been regarded by whoever had arranged them here. The second set of shelves held boxes, each one labeled. Some were archival document boxes, the kind sold specifically for the preservation of paper. Others were smaller, solid, their labels written with careful abbreviation dates that spanned decades. Beside the boxes, a series of flat portfolio cases, the kind used for drawings or prints, each one buckled shut. And along the very bottom shelf, a row of trays containing what she had to crouch down to see properly. Small objects, many of them in velvet-lined, individual cases of the sort used by collectors. She opened one carefully. Inside, bedded in aged velvet, was a coin. It was gold. She did not know enough about coins to identify it by sight, but she knew enough about gold to know what it looked like when she was holding it under a flashlight at 5 in the morning in a hidden room behind a false wall. She replaced the coin in its case and set it back exactly where she had found it. The 2 trunks on the right wall were both locked, but the locks were the same type as the one on the small cabinet at the front of the room off the kitchen, and she noted this and did not try to force them. She moved to the cabinet at the far end. Its doors were closed but not locked. She opened them and stood for a long moment looking at what was inside. 2 shelves. On the upper shelf, more archival boxes and a set of leather-bound books, their spines unmarked. On the lower shelf, a fireproof document safe, compact and solid, with a combination dial on its face. She did not touch the dial. She turned around and looked at the room as a whole, sweeping her flashlight from one end to the other. She stayed there for a long time. The sound of the farmhouse beyond the false wall was very faint, the radiators and the structures creaking, the distant suggestion of wind outside. In here, the quiet was of a different order. The quiet of something preserved. The quiet of things held in readiness for a moment that had been, until now, still coming. She picked up the envelope from the top of the cabinet. She pressed her thumb along the fold and opened it, and took out 2 sheets of paper, folded together. The handwriting was her mother's, and it was effortful, each letter shaped with more deliberate control than the handwriting from the first letter, the pen sometimes pressing too hard where the focus slipped and then pulling back. It cost her something to write this, Nora understood. She had done it anyway. She had not written at the top of this letter. She had not begun with Nora's name. She had begun, instead, with a date, and below the date, a single sentence. I am writing this in case I run out of time before I find the right way to explain it in person, and it has just occurred to me that I may have been waiting for the right way for longer than there was time for. Nora lowered herself to sit on the floor of the small room, her back against the cedar-lined wall, the flashlight balanced against her knee. She read, "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Elsa Calloway had been born in a farmhouse not unlike the one on County Road 9. The third of four daughters raised on a property that grew corn and kept chickens and got by on the particular combination of stubbornness and faith that rural families in difficult decades understood as a way of life rather than a strategy. Her father had died when she was 16, and the property had eventually been sold to cover debts that had accumulated during his illness. Her mother had moved to town. The four daughters had dispersed, and Elsa had carried with her, for the rest of her life, the particular grief of someone who has watched a place they loved disappear, not through catastrophe, but through the slow accumulation of circumstances that individually seemed manageable and collectively proved not to be. When she met and married Thomas Calloway, when they began building the life on Meredith Street that would become the family's fixed point for 40 years, she had not forgotten that grief. She had managed it by building something solid in its place. But she had also, quietly and without discussion, done something else. Her mother's sister, her aunt, a woman named Clara Hessler, who had married into the family that gave this farmhouse its name, had died without children and without a will formal enough to hold up against the claims of creditors, and the farmhouse and its 11 acres had come briefly, through a complicated sequence of legal circumstances in the mid-1960s, into a kind of disputed limbo before being purchased by a land company that had intended to develop it and then abandoned the plan when the development financing collapsed. The land company had sold it in 1971 to a private buyer, and that buyer, who had known Elsa Calloway through a mutual acquaintance and understood something of her attachment to the property, had contacted her and offered her the first right of refusal at a price she could afford if she was willing to make the payments over several years. She had not told Thomas. She had not told anyone. She had managed the payments from a savings account she had maintained separately for this purpose, drawing from money she had set aside from her work as a bookkeeper, from small inheritances, from the particular discipline of a woman who knew how to hold something aside when the reasons for doing so were not yet ready to be spoken aloud. She had, over the following decades, visited the farmhouse regularly. Not always. Not on any schedule anyone would have recognized or predicted, but consistently, in the way of someone maintaining a relationship that exists outside the visible structure of her life. She had paid the property taxes. She had made small repairs when they were urgent enough to require them and deferred the rest. And she had, over the years, brought things here. Small things at first, then larger ones. Objects she encountered in the course of her life that she recognized as valuable in ways that the people selling them had not always understood. She wrote about this with a frankness that suggested she had been waiting a long time to explain it. She was not a collector in the formal sense. She had not set out to assemble what was now in this room. She had simply paid attention, for 50 years, to beautiful and significant things, and she had possessed the particular gift of knowing when the price being asked for something was not the price the thing was actually worth. She had bought carefully. She had bought with patience. She had stored what she bought here. In this room she had built specifically for the purpose, on the counsel of a conservator she had employed in the 1980s to help her understand how to care properly for what she was accumulating. The conservator was the only person besides herself who had known this room existed. He had died in 2003. She had managed everything since on her own. She wrote about specific things in the room. The 7 paintings on the upper shelf, 3 of which she believed were attributable to painters of significant reputation, and 4 of which she could not attribute with certainty, but which her own study and the opinion of the conservator had suggested were of substantial value. She named the painters she believed responsible for the 3 attributable works. Nora read the names and held them in her mind for a moment, not yet sure what to do with them. She wrote about the coins, a collection assembled over 2 decades, primarily from the 19th and early 20th centuries, acquired through estate sales and small auction houses, and one extended correspondence with a dealer in another state who had not understood that the woman writing to him so persistently and knowledgeably was a bookkeeper from a small city who had never formally studied the subject. She wrote about the prints in the portfolio cases, several of which she had purchased from a gallery closing in the late 1970s at prices that, she noted, had since appreciated considerably. She wrote about the safe. She explained that the combination was Nora's birth date. She wrote that inside the safe were documents pertaining to the ownership of everything in the room, the purchase records, the provenance documentation for the paintings, the authentication certificates for the coins and prints, and a set of certificates of deposit she had acquired over the years, placed in long-term accounts and rolled over at each maturity, their value compounding in the quiet of a room nobody knew existed. She wrote, "I want to be honest with you about the numbers, as best as I can estimate them, because I think you deserve to go into this with your eyes open rather than discovering it slowly when you may not be ready. Based on the most recent appraisals I was able to commission privately, and applying the appreciation I believe reasonable for the period since those appraisals, what is in this room represents a value of somewhere between $3.5 and $5 million. This is an estimate. It may be higher. It is not likely to be lower. The safe contains certificates of deposit whose current value is approximately $640,000. Nora stopped reading. She read the sentence again. She set the letter down on the floor in front of her and sat with her back against the cedar wall and the flashlight angled at the ceiling and breathed very slowly and carefully for a long moment. The way she had learned to breathe during the hardest periods of the past 4 years. The breath that was not about calm exactly, but about creating enough space between the feeling and the response to get the response right. Her mother who had lived in the house on Meredith Street, and kept the garden and driven the sensible car, and bought the children reasonable gifts and never, in all the years Nora had known her, behaved as though she had access to anything beyond what was visibly in front of her. Her mother who had managed the appearance of a comfortable but modest life with such consistency and such total absence of display that it had never occurred to anyone, not Richard or Sandra or Nora herself, to look for anything else. She picked the letter back up. Elsa wrote that she had thought many times about how to transfer this to the family in a more transparent way and had always come back to the same obstacle. Whatever she gave to all 3 children equally would be received equally and divided and dispersed. Richard would invest it strategically. Sandra would manage it carefully. And neither of those things was wrong. But what she had built here was not the kind of thing she wanted dispersed. She had built it as a single thing, with a single intention, and she had wanted it to go to the person who would understand what to do with it the way Elsa herself had understood what to do with it, which was to say, to do it seriously and thoughtfully, and without losing sight of the people it was meant to protect. She wrote Nora's name again at this point in the letter. Just her name, in the middle of a sentence, as though she needed to look at it. She wrote that she was sorry for the difficulty that would follow, that she knew Richard and Sandra would not receive this well, and that she regretted being unable to find a way to resolve what she wanted to give Nora without creating the kind of conflict she had never wanted to author. She wrote that she believed, after long consideration, that Nora was capable of handling whatever came, including that. She wrote that she was proud of her youngest daughter, that the word proud didn't fully cover it, but that it was the word she had. The letter ended there, not with an instruction or an explanation. With her name, Elsa. Nora sat on the floor of the hidden room behind the false wall of the farmhouse on County Road 9 and held the letter in both hands and let the tears come, because they were going to come whether she allowed them or not, and it was better to be the one deciding. She cried quietly and thoroughly, the way she had cried on the night her mother died, and on the morning after the first will reading, privately, and without performance, the grief and the gratitude arriving together in the tangled way they always did, and refusing to be separated into anything neater. When it passed, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her work jacket and took a long breath of the cedar-scented air and looked around the room again, at the paintings in their careful wrappings, at the coin trays in their velvet cases, at the portfolio cases stacked along the lower shelf, at the cabinet with the document safe behind its wooden doors. She thought about her mother sitting in this room, alone, in whatever year she had last been here, checking the conditions, reviewing the documents, making her assessments, carrying this all by herself for decades, with no one to share it with, because she had understood that the sharing would change it. She thought about her children asleep upstairs in the farmhouse her mother had given her. She stood up. She took one more careful look at the room. Then she walked out through the small door, pulled it mostly closed behind her, and went to the kitchen to make coffee and wait for her children to wake up, because she needed to think before she did anything else. and she had learned by now that she thought best in the kitchen, with something warm in her hands and the particular ordinary sounds of the morning coming in around her. She did not think about the number. She would let herself think about it later. For now, she thought about the sequence. The things she needed to do, in order, each one done correctly. The first thing was to see the room properly in daylight. She waited until the October sun had climbed high enough to be useful, which it managed by 8:30, and then she went back with a battery-powered work lamp she had found in the closet off the kitchen and spent an hour in the hidden room doing nothing but looking carefully at each item in its place. She did not move anything. She did not unwrap anything. She looked. She was not an appraiser. She was not a conservator or an art historian or a coin dealer. But she was a woman who had been paying close attention to things for 43 years, and she trusted her attention. What she saw in that room, in the generous light of the work lamp, was a collection that had been assembled by someone who knew what they were doing. The wrappings were proper. The storage conditions, temperature and humidity regulated, as she understood now, by a small system she had not initially noticed behind the cabinet, a device that ran on the same electrical line as the outlet she had found last week that she hadn't been able to identify a purpose for. The organization was meticulous, everything labeled and documented in the same decisive handwriting she had known her whole life. She went back to the kitchen. She sat at Gerald Briggs's table and wrote a list. At the top she wrote appraiser. Beneath that, attorney, not Harold Pettigrew. She had decided on this in the kitchen during her first cup of coffee, because she trusted Pettigrew with standard matters, and this was not a standard matter. She would ask Ruth Edgars if she knew someone. Below that she wrote inventory log, with a note to herself to photograph everything before anything was moved. Below that she wrote certificate of deposit, bank contact. Below that she wrote, and then crossed out, and then rewrote in capital letters, tell in 01. She held that last instruction in mind for the rest of the morning, which she spent doing her regular bookkeeping work on the laptop at the kitchen table while Maya was at school and Lucas was at school and the farmhouse settled around her in its usual morning rhythms, the radiators and the floorboards and the distant sound of wind in the oaks at the front of the property. She called Ruth Edgars at 10:30. Ruth answered on the second ring with a directness that suggested she had never spent a significant portion of her life waiting for callers to state their business. Yes, she said. Nora asked whether Ruth happened to know a good appraiser, someone who handled estates and property and objects of value, someone discreet. There was a short silence, the kind of silence that has something moving around inside it. Then Ruth said, "Is this about what I think it might be about?" Nora did not ask how she knew. She simply said she thought so. Ruth was quiet for another moment. Then she said that she had a name. She said she had been holding on to it for 11 years, since a conversation she'd had with Elsa Calloway at the grocery store checkout line, in which Elsa had said, without quite explaining herself, that if anything ever happened and Nora needed someone who knew about these things, Ruth should give her the name of a man named Garrison Howell, who had an office in the city and who was as good and discreet as they came. Nora closed her eyes. Her mother had thought about everything, every single step. She asked for the name and number. Ruth gave them to her, and then said, "Nora," and stopped. Nora waited. Ruth said, "Are you all right?" Nora said she thought so. She said she would know better in a few days. Ruth said to call if she needed anything and meant it in a way that felt like a door opening rather than a polite formula. Garrison Howell answered his own phone. He was a man of around 60, by the sound of him, with the unhurried manner of someone who understood that the matters his clients brought to him generally required steadiness more than speed. When Nora explained that she had recently come into a property and discovered a collection of stored items that she believed might be significant and that she needed an assessment conducted with complete confidentiality, there was a brief pause that sounded like the settling of professional attention. He asked a few careful questions. She answered them with approximately the same level of detail. He asked if she could photograph the items and send them to his office email before he visited, so that he could prepare himself adequately. She said yes. She spent the afternoon of that day in the hidden room with her phone, photographing everything systematically. Each painting in its wrapping, the label visible. Each tray of coins, open, showing the pieces in their velvet. The portfolio cases, closed, and then the first one opened to show a sample of what was inside. The exterior of the document safe. The certificate of deposit documents, which she removed from the safe with the combination her mother had left her. The combination worked immediately, the dial turning with a precision that told her it had been serviced and maintained and laid on the floor of the room to photograph clearly. The leather-bound books, which turned out to be her mother's journals, meticulous records of purchases with dates and locations and prices paid, and what she had read and learned about each acquisition. She sent the photographs to Garrison Howell's office at 4:30 that afternoon. He replied at 7:30 that evening with a message that was professionally measured and contained almost no information, which told her by its very restraint that he had seen what she had sent and had significant reactions to it, that he preferred not to commit to writing before he had been in the room himself. He came 2 days later. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s, with the careful hands of someone accustomed to handling things that could not be replaced. He arrived in an unmarked car, which she had asked for, and he carried nothing more than a leather briefcase and a portable ultraviolet lamp. She met him at the gate, and they walked the path to the farmhouse in the October morning without discussing anything beyond the weather and the condition of the oak trees. She brought him directly to the small room. He stood in the doorway of the hidden room for a long moment before entering. Then he stepped inside and began his examination. He did not speak much for the first hour. He examined the paintings one by one, unwrapping them with a care that matched the care with which they had been wrapped, using the UV lamp and a jeweler's loupe he had taken from his case. He spent the most time with 3 of the 7, and the time he spent with them was of a different quality than the time he spent with the others. He was not hurrying through those 3. He was making sure. He was verifying something he had begun to suspect from the photographs. He examined the coins systematically, working through the trays tray by tray. He spent time with the prints. He photographed extensively with his own camera. He opened the leather journals and read sections of them with a focused attention that made Nora feel, watching from the doorway, that she was watching someone discover a language they had not known existed. At the end of the first hour, he came out of the room and went to the kitchen table and sat down and placed his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "I want to be careful here. You understand that a formal appraisal with full documentation will take time. There are pieces in that room that will need to go to specialists. I am not the last word on everything I've seen this morning. I want to be clear about that." She said she understood. He said, with those qualifications stated, that she needed to understand that what was in that room was not a modest find. He said the 3 paintings he had spent the most time with were, in his professional opinion, authentic examples of work by artists whose output was extremely limited and extremely well documented. He named them carefully, with the precision of someone selecting words that needed to hold up later. 2 were painters of the American regionalist tradition, well known within the field, whose authenticated works had sold at major auction houses within the past 5 years at prices starting at $250,000 and reaching considerably higher. The third was something else entirely. It was a work he had been looking for a reference to for many years. A piece attributed to a European master that had been listed as missing since the 1940s, not stolen exactly, but displaced in the disruptions of that period and never subsequently located. He did not want to speculate on its value before authentication was complete. He said that with some restraint she recognized was costing him effort. He turned to the coins. He said the collection was extraordinary. He said whoever had assembled it had done so with serious scholarship and serious patience. He would need to catalog each piece individually, but on initial examination, he could say that the collection included examples of significant American gold coinage from the 19th century, several of which he had seen comparable examples of sell for between $40,000 and $120,000 apiece. He paused. He looked at the table. He said, "In total, I am not in a position to give you a number today. What I can tell you is that the number, when we arrive at it, will require more zeros than you may currently be expecting." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October wind moved through the oaks. Nora said, "My mother estimated between 3.5 and 5 million. Garrison Howell looked at her. He took a breath. He said that he thought her mother's estimate had been conservative. She let that sit between them for a moment. Then she asked what the process was. What happened next, step by step. He talked for 20 minutes about provenance documentation, specialist authentication, auction timelines, insurance writers, estate attorney involvement. She took notes. She asked questions. She was specific and organized, and he could see her processing everything in the careful, methodical way of someone who was not in danger of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of it. He seemed, by the end of the conversation, to have developed a particular respect for her, the kind that arrives without ceremony when someone performs in a manner you had not expected. Before he left, he stopped at the door of the farmhouse and looked back at the building. Then he looked at her. He said, "Your mother was an extraordinary woman." Nora said yes. She was. He drove away in his unmarked car, and she stood on the porch for a long time after, the October sky very blue above the oaks, the cold sharp and clean, and full of the particular smell of the season changing. She was still standing there when Maya's school bus stopped at the end of the road. Maya walked up the path carrying her backpack, her footsteps unhurried, her face with the particular composure of someone who has been thinking about something all day and is now approaching the person they want to tell it to. She came up to the porch and looked at her mother. She said, "You found something." It was not a question. Nora looked at her daughter, 9 years old, watching her with Elsa Calloway's eyes, with the same quality of attention that had once sat across from Harold Pettigrew in a lawyer's office and assessed the room and everything in it without giving anything away. She said yes. "I found something." Maya set her backpack down on the porch step and sat down beside it, pulling her knees to her chest. She said, "Is it what Grandma left us?" Nora sat down next to her. She said she thought so. They sat together on the porch in the October cold for a few minutes, the oaks moving in the wind, the fields beyond the house brown and still. Then Maya said, "Does this mean we get to stay?" Nora thought about the number Garrison Howell had not quite said, but had moved toward. She thought about the certificate of deposit documents in the safe. She thought about her mother building this room for 50 years, alone and patient, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. She said yes. "We get to stay?" Maya nodded. Once, the same decisive nod she had used her whole life, when she had confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she picked up her backpack and went inside to start her homework. 3 days after Garrison Howell's visit, Nora drove to a law office in the city and sat down with an attorney named Patricia Cho, who had been recommended not by Harold Pettigrew, but by a professional contact Nora had identified through her own research. Patricia Cho was 45, compact in her manner, and gave the impression of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had eventually decided to find this useful. She listened to Nora's account without interrupting. She asked 4 questions at the end, each one precise and specific, the kind of questions that told you immediately what kind of mind was behind them. She said she would need to review the trust documents and the appraisal when it was complete. She said that the hidden room, having been part of the property at the time it was transferred into the trust, was part of the trust's assets. She said the contents, having been placed in the room by the trust grantor during the period of the trust's existence, were an extension of the trust property. She said the case for the sole beneficiary's ownership of the contents was, in her assessment, extremely solid. She said Nora should prepare for the possibility that someone might try to contest it anyway. Nora said she was already prepared for that. Patricia Cho looked at her with the particular assessment she had been conducting throughout the meeting. Then she said, "Good," and moved on to the next question. It was 10 days after the discovery of the room when Richard called. Nora had not told him. She had not told Sandra or anyone in the family. She had told Ruth Edgars, minimally, because Ruth had been the link to Garrison Howell, and because Ruth Edgars was the kind of person who understood what she was trusted with. She had told no one else. But news in a county this size does not always require a direct communication to move. Garrison Howell had visited with a professional colleague 2 days after his initial examination to look at the third painting. A specialist restorer had been to the farmhouse the following week to assess the condition of the paintings for insurance purposes. Cars in the driveway of the old Hessler place, coming and going, noted by people who had been watching the old Hessler place with the particular attention that property contested or rumored attracts in small communities. Dale Pruitt had seen one of the cars. He had not known what it meant, but had known it meant something. He had mentioned it to someone. The someone had mentioned it to someone else. And somewhere in that chain of casual information, a connection had been made to someone who knew Richard Calloway. Richard's voice on the phone was careful in a way that told her he was being deliberate about being careful. He said he had heard she had people coming and going at the farmhouse. He said he was glad she was getting things looked at. He asked, casually, what was going on. She said she was having some items on the property assessed. He asked what kind of items. She said she wasn't ready to go into detail yet. The silence that followed had the shape of a calculation being done in real time. She could almost hear the way his understanding of the situation was revising itself against information he did not yet have, but was beginning to sense the contours of. He said he hoped she understood that any assets located on or within the property at the time of their mother's death were subject to review as part of the estate. She said she had a very good attorney. Another silence, and this one had a different temperature. He said, "Nora, we're family." She said she knew that. She said she hoped they could handle whatever came as a family. She said she thought they could, if everyone was reasonable. She said goodnight. She set her phone on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked out the window at the oak trees, which were nearly fully turned now, the leaves amber and gold in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that made everything it touched look as though it might be worth more than anyone had been told. Sandra called the following morning. Her voice was more controlled than Richard's, which was almost always the case, but beneath the control was something she could not entirely flatten, a quality of reevaluation that Nora recognized because she had heard it once before, on the day she had first told her siblings about the farmhouse being left to her alone. The sound of someone discovering that the picture they had formed in their mind was missing a significant portion, and that the portion was not small. Sandra said she was sure that Nora had done everything properly. She said she was sure the trust documents were solid. She said that what she really wanted was to make sure that everyone was handling this in a way that honored their mother's memory. Nora said she was handling it exactly that way. Sandra said she imagined whatever had been found was probably not as significant as the early rumors seemed to suggest. She said she had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that appraisers had been at the farmhouse, and she was sure it was routine. Nora said she thought Sandra should speak to her own attorney before making assumptions about what was routine. There was a pause, a longer one than Sandra usually allowed herself. Then she said, "I see." She said goodbye and hung up, and Nora sat with the phone in the silence for a moment and then went back to work. The formal appraisal came in 6 weeks later, in a document 43 pages long, with addenda attached from 3 specialist consultants and a Providence researcher whose investigation into the third painting, the one Garrison Howell had been careful about in his initial visit, had produced a result that Nora read 3 times before she was willing to accept it as literal. The painting had been authenticated. It was not merely significant. It was the kind of significant that had its own category of coverage in major publications, the kind that museums issued statements about, the kind whose discovery constituted what the Providence researcher called, in the careful language of the field, a material event. The value assigned to it in the appraisal was given as a range. The bottom of the range was $7 million. The full appraisal of the room's contents, including the authenticated paintings, the coin collection, the prints, the objects and ceramics, and the certificate of deposit instruments in the safe, placed the total value at between $12 and $17 million, with the recommendation that the European painting go to a specialist auction where competitive bidding would likely drive the final price significantly above the lower range estimate, $12 to $17 million. Nora sat at Gerald Briggs's kitchen table on the night she received the appraisal, long after the children were asleep, and held the number in her mind the way you hold a very heavy thing when you are deciding how to carry it. Not because it was too large to understand. She understood it. She understood it with the specific, clear-eyed understanding of a woman who had spent 4 years balancing a budget that left no room for error and who knew exactly what each additional zero at the end of a number meant in the arithmetic of a life. She thought about her mother, about the courage it had taken to build this quietly and alone, about the patience, about the certainty that the right moment would come, about the 50 years of paying attention to beautiful things that nobody else thought were worth paying attention to, and understanding them, and protecting them, and believing that eventually they would protect someone in return. She turned out the kitchen light and went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the children's room for a moment, watching the shape of Maya and Lucas in the dark, their breathing quiet and even and entirely themselves. Then she went to her room and lay down and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time since January, feel something adjacent to relief. Outside, the October wind moved through the oak trees that had been on this land since before any of them were born. The farmhouse settled and ticked around her, familiar now in its sounds, known. The cold was there, but it was manageable. The path from the gate was clear. The radiators were working. And somewhere behind a false wall in the small room off the kitchen, behind a cedar-lined space that had held its contents in careful silence for decades. The things her mother had gathered and protected and believed in were still waiting, as they had always waited, with the patient certainty of things that know they will be recognized eventually by the right hands. Nora closed her eyes. She thought, there is still more. There was always more with her mother. The room had been found, and the paintings, and the coins, and the number on the appraisal that she was still not entirely sure she had the right to hold. But Richard was already speaking to attorneys. Sandra was already recalculating. The community was already whispering on its own particular frequency. And somewhere in the 43 pages of the appraisal and the journals her mother had kept, and the leather-bound record of 50 years of careful, private, determined accumulation, there were threads she had not yet followed to their end. She knew the shape of this. She had learned it from Elsa. The place revealed itself when you lived in it. When you cleared the brush and fixed the heat and paid attention and were patient. When you showed up every day without knowing exactly what you were showing up for. The story was not finished. It had barely begun. The legal letters arrived on a Tuesday in November, 3 of them, in envelopes that were slightly too formal and slightly too heavy to be anything other than what they were. They came by certified mail, which meant she had to sign for them at the door with the carrier waiting, and she did this with the same steady composure she had been practicing for weeks, because she had known they were coming and had decided in advance that they would not arrive as a surprise she was not prepared to receive. She set the envelopes on the kitchen table and made coffee before she opened them. This was a choice, deliberate and small. The envelopes could wait 3 minutes. They had already been in motion for days, drafted and reviewed and sent by people who had resources and reasons she understood clearly. 3 minutes of coffee making was not going to change what was inside them, but it was going to change how she felt when she opened them, and that mattered. She read them at the table with both hands wrapped around her mug. The first was from a law firm representing Richard. The second was from a firm representing Sandra. The third was from both of them jointly, a preliminary notice of intent to contest the ownership of assets discovered within the property at County Road 9 on the grounds that any assets present within the property at the time of their mother's death constituted part of the estate and were therefore subject to equal distribution among all heirs. The language was careful and specific and had clearly been assembled by people who knew their field well and had been given the information necessary to shape their argument precisely. She read all 3 through twice. Then she set them aside and called Patricia Cho. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Patricia Cho read the documents the same afternoon. She called Nora back at 4:15 and spoke for 11 minutes, during which time Nora took notes and asked for questions and said almost nothing else. Patricia's assessment was direct and without unnecessary cushioning. The challenge was not frivolous. It was not going to disappear on its own, but it was also not, in her professional opinion, likely to succeed. The trust had been established with proper legal form 4 years before Elsa Calloway's death, transferring the property into the trust during Elsa's lifetime. The contents of the room assembled over decades and stored within the property that had been in the trust's ownership were part of the trust's assets, not the estate's. The estate was the collection of assets Elsa held at her death outside the trust. The farmhouse and everything within it had not been part of the estate at the time of her death because it had been outside the estate for 4 years. The legal distinction, Patricia said, was not ambiguous. It was the kind of distinction that courts had addressed many times and resolved in the same direction consistently. What the challenge would do, regardless of its ultimate outcome, was take time. And time, in these situations, was the mechanism by which pressure was applied. She should expect the process to extend for months. She should expect communications from their attorneys that were designed to feel more threatening than the underlying legal position warranted. She should hold her line, let Patricia handle the responses, and not engage directly with Richard or Sandra about the legal matters at all. Nora said she understood. Patricia said she was going to enjoy this case. She said it with a professionalism that left no room for doubt about what she meant by enjoy. The weeks that followed had a particular quality. Not quiet exactly, but pressurized in a way that was external rather than internal, the way weather feels before it breaks. Legal correspondence arrived and was forwarded to Patricia. Garrison Howell continued the appraisal process, bringing in the specialist consultants whose Assessments were turning the initial estimates into documented certainties. The Provenance researcher completed her report on the European painting, a document that was 41 pages long and referenced archives in 3 countries. Nora read it twice, carefully, and understood approximately 70% of it, which she considered adequate. The painting, it turned out, had a history. Not a dark one. Not the kind of history that complicated ownership, but the kind that deepened value. A record of creation, exhibition, and subsequent disappearance during the displacement of the war years that had made it, in the precise language of the researcher's report, one of the most sought-after works in its category by collectors and institutions who had been tracking its possible locations for decades. How Elsa Calloway had come to possess it was a question the Provenance research answered in the way the best research answers difficult questions. Not completely, but sufficiently. There was a record of a private sale in the late 1970s from a dealer in the Northeast who had acquired it from a European émigré estate. The estate's connection to the original owner documented in correspondence the researcher had found in a university archive. The chain was not perfect, but it was credible, and credibility at this level was worth considerably more than most people imagined. Garrison Howell brought the news about the auction house himself, in person, at the kitchen table, with the formality of someone who understood the weight of what he was delivering. A major auction house in New York had agreed to take the European painting. The pre-sale estimate, published in the auction catalog and therefore now part of the documented record, was $8 to $12 million. This estimate, Garrison explained, was conservative by design. Auction houses published conservative estimates because the distance between the estimate and the hammer price was part of what made a successful sale feel like an event. He believed the final price would exceed the upper estimate. Nora sat with this for a moment. She asked about the timeline. He said the auction was scheduled for late January, approximately 11 weeks from now. She nodded. She said she would be there. He looked at her with the same expression he had first given her the morning he came to the farmhouse and spent an hour in the hidden room in silence. Respectful and slightly surprised and adjusting. He said good. He thought she should be. She told the children on a Saturday, sitting at the kitchen table with the oak trees visible through the window, their leaves mostly gone now, the branches clean and angular against the November sky. She had thought about how to do this for several weeks. She had decided to tell them as close to the truth as she could manage without overwhelming them with numbers that meant nothing at 9 and 7 years old, because she was their mother and her job was to prepare them for the reality of their life without either catastrophizing it or dressing it up in a way that would require later correction. She said that their grandmother had left something hidden in the farmhouse, something she had spent a very long time putting together, piece by piece, because she loved them and she had been thinking about them even before they were born, in the way that people who love you spend time thinking about things you don't know about yet. Lucas asked if it was treasure. She said yes. That was a good way to put it. He thought about this with the serious attention he brought to all important information. Then he asked if Victor the elephant had known. She told him she thought Victor might have had an idea. Maya was quiet throughout this, in the way she was quiet when she was holding something large and deciding what to do with it. Then she asked whether things were going to change. Nora said yes. Some things were going to change. They would have more room to move. There were things she had been worried about that she was not going to have to worry about anymore. The farmhouse was going to get properly fixed. Maya's school, which she had been thinking about, was possible now. Lucas's, too. Maya said, but we stay here. Nora said yes. We stay. Maya looked out the window at the oak trees for a moment. Then she said, good. Grandma would want that. Nora looked at her daughter and felt the specific, precise quality of being known by someone who shares your blood and your habits of mind. The feeling of being seen clearly, without effort or explanation. She said yes. She would. The community had been assembling its understanding of what was happening at the old Hessler farmhouse in the way small communities always do, through the accumulated triangulation of observed detail and shared speculation and the occasional piece of specific information that drifted from one person to the next and arrived at its destination changed, but recognizable. What had begun as curiosity about the unfamiliar cars in the driveway had become, by November, a general understanding that something significant had been found inside the farmhouse. The specific nature of that something remained imprecise in most conversations, amplified in some, underestimated in others, But the directional consensus was clear. Nora Calloway had discovered something valuable, and the family that had dismissed her inheritance as a ruin was not taking it well. Ruth Eggers came by on a Wednesday evening with a bottle of something she said she had been keeping for an occasion and which, in her assessment, this qualified as. She sat at the kitchen table and listened while Nora told her, carefully and completely, the full story of what had been in the room and what the appraisers had determined and what the auction house had agreed to take. Ruth did not react with the expressions most people would have used. She did not gasp or reach for superlatives or fill the air with the kind of excited noise that discovery usually produces in listeners. She sat with her hands around the bottle and her eyes steady and took the information in the way she took most things, quietly and with total attention. When Nora finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She never told me what it was, only that there was something, and that the right person would find it when the time was right." She said this not with the bitterness of someone excluded, but with the recognition of someone seeing a design she had only partially glimpsed in its completed form. She said, "Elsa knew you would need it more than the others, but she also knew you were the only one who would have found it. The others would have sold the farmhouse inside of 6 months, and nobody would have cleared that room properly for years, if ever." Nora thought about Richard's first call after she told him about the farmhouse. The word liquidating arriving before the silence had fully settled. She said she thought that was probably right. Ruth poured 2 glasses of the something she had been keeping, and they sat together in the November kitchen and did not say much else for a while. And the quality of that silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that has earned its ease. Dale Pruitt appeared at the gate on a Thursday morning in December, and the way he appeared was entirely different from the way he had appeared in October. In October, he had stopped his truck at the gate with the casual authority of someone who considered the situation already understood. In December, he parked further back and walked to the gate on foot, which was a small but legible shift in posture. He held his hat in his hands, which he had not done before. He said he had heard about what had been found and that he wanted to say he was glad for her. He said the developer, his client, had done some rethinking about the land in light of current circumstances and would not be making any further inquiries. He said he hoped the legal situation with her family was resolving itself. She thanked him for coming by. He nodded, replaced his hat, and walked back to his truck. She watched him go with the particular equanimity of someone who does not require the acknowledgement but can receive it without making it smaller than it is. Richard called one more time before the legal process had run its course, in early December, on a Sunday evening. The call was different from the ones before it. The careful management of tone that he had been applying since November was still there, but beneath it something had shifted, something that sounded, when she listened carefully, like the beginning of acknowledgement. He said that his attorney had reviewed the trust documents more thoroughly and had provided some additional context about the probable outcome of the challenge. He said he wanted to have a conversation. Not a legal conversation, but a family one. She said she was open to that. He said he thought their mother had done something remarkable. He said it in the tone of someone saying a thing they have been resisting for weeks and have finally decided is the accurate thing to say. She said yes. She did. He said he thought he understood now why she had done it the way she had done it, with the separate trust, the hidden room, the sequence of things timed and arranged so carefully. He said he thought he understood what she had been accounting for. Nora waited. He said, "She was accounting for what you did, for the years you were there." He paused. She was making it right in the only way she thought would hold. The line was quiet for a moment. She said she didn't know if making it right was the right way to think about it. She said their mother hadn't been keeping score. She had just been paying attention. Richard said yes. He thought that was probably true. He said he was going to withdraw the challenge. He said Sandra had already agreed to do the same. He said he thought they should let their mother's intentions stand. She said she appreciated that. She meant it. He said he was glad she had found it. He said it quietly, without decoration. She said good night and held the phone after the call ended and looked at the kitchen wall. She did not feel triumph. She had not been expecting to feel it, and she did not miss its absence. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, a kind of resolution. Not the resolution of having won something, but the resolution of a long and complicated piece of music reaching the note it had been moving toward. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The legal challenges were formally withdrawn in the second week of December. Patricia Cho filed the confirmatory paperwork with the efficiency and thoroughness Nora had come to expect from her and sent a brief, precise email with no unnecessary words. It was done. The trust held. The assets were Nora's, clear and uncontested. She sat with the news the way she had been sitting with all the news of the past several weeks, steadily and without hurry, giving it the time it needed to settle into something she could carry properly. She was not in the habit of rushing toward feelings. She had learned, through the particular school of difficult years, that feelings arrived in their own time, and that attempting to accelerate them generally produced something less true than what would have arrived on its own. She called Patricia to thank her. Patricia said the pleasure had been genuine. She said Nora should call when the auction concluded. She said she had a feeling about the number. The auction was on the last Friday of January. Nora drove to the city the previous afternoon, staying overnight in a hotel she had booked with a care that was more habitual than necessary, comparing prices and distances and reading reviews with the vigilance she had always applied to things that cost money, even though the reason for that vigilance was dissolving beneath her. Old habits. She was not sure she wanted to lose all of them. They had served her well, and she respected what they represented, the years of attention, the practice of never allowing a dollar to pass through her hands unexamined. That kind of discipline was not something you discarded because the numbers had changed. It was part of who you were. She brought Maya and Lucas with her. She had considered leaving them with Ruth Edgars, who had offered without being asked, but she had decided against it. This was part of their story. They had a right to be present at the moment their grandmother's work arrived at its public destination. Whatever happened in that room on Friday evening would shape the rest of their lives in a real and specific way, and she wanted them to be able to say, when they were older and able to understand the full weight of it, that they had been there, that they had seen it happen. She bought Maya a dress from a small shop near the hotel. Not expensive by the standards of what she could now afford, but chosen carefully, the kind of dress a 9-year-old wears when she has been somewhere important and wants to feel appropriate to the occasion. Maya accepted it with the quiet dignity of someone receiving exactly the right thing. Lucas wore his school clothes and his good jacket and carried Victor the elephant in the jacket's inner pocket, which Nora permitted because some things were worth the irregularity. Garrison Howell met them in the lobby of the auction house and walked them in personally, which was a courtesy he had offered without being asked, and which she accepted with the recognition that he was doing it partly for the children, partly to steady the occasion with professional presence. The room was filling when they arrived. Nora studied it the way she studied any room she needed to understand quickly. The layout, the positions of the phone staff along the side wall, the proportion of serious buyers to observers, the particular quality of attention that the room as a whole was generating. It was a room that understood exactly what was about to happen inside it. The catalog entry for the painting included a full-color plate reproduction and, below it, the provenance summary the researcher had assembled, the chain of custody rendered in clean institutional language that gave no indication of the 50 years of private and patient conviction that had produced the moment of its publication. Nora read the entry 3 times while they waited for the sale to begin. Maya sat beside her with her own copy of the catalog, reading the same entry with the focused attention she gave to everything worth reading. After a while she said, without looking up, "Grandma's name isn't in here." Nora said no. It was in the documentation the auction house had reviewed, but not in the catalog. Maya thought about this. She said, "That seems right. Grandma didn't really need her name in things." Nora looked at her daughter. She thought about Elsa Calloway going about her life on Meredith Street for 50 years, the visible surface of it indistinguishable from the life of any careful, modest, serious woman, while beneath that surface this other story ran in parallel, invisible and entirely deliberate. She said yes. She didn't need that. The sale began. Lots moved through the room with the particular theater of high-stakes auctions, the auctioneer's voice steady and rapid, the paddles rising with the casual precision of people who had done this many times. Nora watched the room. She watched the buyers, those present and the ones represented by staff members at phones along the sidewall, speaking quietly into their receivers to clients on the other end who were watching from elsewhere in the world. When the European painting's lot number was called, she felt Maya sit up slightly straighter beside her. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $4 million. The room responded immediately. Paddles appeared. Phone lines engaged. The numbers climbed with a speed that had a different quality from the earlier lots, less deliberate, more committed, as though the bidders had been waiting with specific intentions and were now simply executing them. 6 million. 8 million. The room thinned as bidders fell away. 10 million. A pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, during which Nora did not breathe. 11 million. 11.5. 12 million. The auctioneer's voice maintained its register. His eyes moved between two phone staff members and a single paddle in the room. A woman in a gray jacket seated 3 rows ahead of Nora, who had been bidding with the economy of movement that signaled either absolute certainty or the specific composure of a professional bidding on behalf of a client whose resources were not a limiting factor. 12.5. 13 million. The paddle in the gray jacket went still. One phone line. 13 million, the auctioneer said, going once. 13 million, going twice. The gavel came down. The room exhaled. A sound moved through it. Not quite applause and not quite silence. The particular acoustic signature of a space full of people who understand they have just witnessed something that will be cited in future conversations about this category of work, about this artist, about this season. Garrison Howell, seated 2 chairs to Nora's right, made a small sound that was not a word. Maya looked at her mother. Her face was very still in the way it went when she was holding something significant carefully, processing it before allowing it to show. Nora looked back at her. She felt the tears arriving and she let them come because they were the clean kind, the kind that do not require explanation and do not embarrass anyone, least of all themselves. Lucas asked, in a whisper, whether the elephant had brought good luck. She put her arm around him and said yes. She thought it probably had. The painting sold for $13 million. After the fees and the auction house commission, the net to the trust was $11,200,000. Combined with the appraised value of the remaining collection items, the 6 other paintings, the coin collection, the prints, the objects, the ceramics, all of which Garrison Howell had arranged to place through a combination of specialist dealers and smaller auction sales over the following months, and the certificate of deposit instruments from the safe. The total realized value of what Elsa Calloway had left in the hidden room of the farmhouse on County Road 9 came to just under $16 million. $16 million. Assembled coin by coin, painting by painting, print by print, over 50 years, by a woman who had grown up with nothing, who had built a quiet life in a house on Meredith Street, and who had carried this inside her, privately and with total conviction, for as long as most of the people who thought they knew her had been alive. Nora sat with the final accounting documents on the kitchen table of the farmhouse on a February morning and looked at them for a long time. The oak trees outside the window were bare, but held the suggestion of what was coming, the buds still tight and patient against the cold. She had learned to read the oaks the way her mother had read this place, with the understanding that what you saw was never the whole story, that the most important things were always in the process of becoming visible. She made a list. She had always made lists. It was one of the habits she intended to keep regardless of how many zeros the balance changed by. The first item on the list was the farmhouse. Not selling it. Restoring it. She had spent the winter working with a structural engineer and a contractor whose references Ruth Edgars had provided with the same brisk certainty she applied to everything. And the assessment had been what she had suspected. The bones were excellent, the problems addressable, the work significant, but not beyond what could be done by people who understood what they were working with. The collapsed roof section was the most urgent. She had authorized the repair in December and watched it completed in January with the specific satisfaction of seeing a wound closed. The exterior would be resided. The windows replaced, all of them, with glass that acknowledged the farmhouse's age while performing better than what the age had produced. The furnace would be updated. The plumbing assessed fully and modernized where needed. The kitchen would be redone in a way that kept the wide plank floors and the proportions of the original room, while adding what years of inadequate equipment had made her realize she had been managing without. She was not going to turn the farmhouse into something it was not. She had thought about this carefully. It was going to be what it had always wanted to be, only properly. A farmhouse on 11 acres of good land, lived in by a family who understood that the value of a place was not in what it looked like from the gate, but in what it contained, including the things you didn't find until you were ready. The second item on the list was the children. Maya's school was arranged. A private school in the county with a strong academic program and the particular culture of a place that takes children seriously, that she had been keeping track of for 2 years without being able to afford. Lucas's enrollment would follow the year after. There were education accounts established with amounts that meant neither of them would need to navigate the specific anxiety of funding a future on terms they hadn't chosen. She had set this up before anything else because it was the thing that mattered most with the most immediacy, the thing her mother had known would matter most. The third item was the debts. She paid them all. Every outstanding balance, every deferred payment, every account that had been accumulating the particular weight of things you cannot address right now but carry with you constantly. She paid them in the first week, before the larger decisions, because she had learned that the thing you owe someone changes the texture of every interaction until you have addressed it, and she preferred to move through the world without that particular friction. The fourth item on the list was Ruth Edgar's. This required more thought than the financial items, because it was not a financial thing. She considered it for several weeks before she arrived at what felt right. She had the east section of the property's 11 acres, the portion that abutted Ruth's land, assessed for easement. She arranged with an attorney to establish a formal easement agreement granting Ruth and her heirs permanent access to that section for whatever use they chose. She then had a small greenhouse built at the edge of the property where the two lands touched, fully outfitted for year-round use, and presented Ruth with the keys on a March morning with no ceremony beyond a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Ruth looked at the keys for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora with the expression she used when something had confirmed what she already knew. She said, "Your mother raised you right." Nora said she had. Ruth pocketed the keys and drank her coffee and did not make it sentimental, which was exactly what Nora had expected and why she had done it this way. The summer came slowly, the way summers do in places that have had a long winter. The farmhouse was transformed by June, not into something new, but into a fuller version of what it had always been. The clapboard restored and painted the color of the interior of a birch tree, the roof solid and unbreached, the windows catching light in the way of glass that has been properly installed, the path from the gate freshly graveled and flanked by the first stages of what she intended to be a proper garden, drawing from the knowledge of her mother's garden on Meredith Street in the way that all good inheritance draws from what came before it. The 11 acres were assessed by an agricultural consultant Garrison Howell had recommended, and the fields that had been going back to meadow for decades were found to be exactly what Elsa's letter had said. Good land. Land that with attention could produce something worth producing. She was not a farmer and had no plans to become one, but she leased 4 acres to a young woman 2 miles down the road who grew specialty vegetables for restaurant clients in the city, and the sight of those 4 acres actively tended in the summer light was the kind of satisfaction that did not need to be explained to be felt. Richard came to the farmhouse in April. He called first, which she had not expected, and he came alone, without Patricia his wife, and without the administrative energy he usually brought to family situations. He parked at the gate and walked the path the way visitors did, and stood on the restored porch, and looked at the farmhouse with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something that was not calculation or management, or the careful professional composure he wore so consistently that it had become indistinguishable from his actual face. She brought him inside and showed him the kitchen, the sitting room, the rooms upstairs that were finished now and light and proportioned correctly for the first time in decades. She showed him the small room off the kitchen, which she had kept as it was, the cedar-lined space behind the false wall accessible through the door she had rehung on proper hinges, the shelving now mostly empty, the trunks and the cabinet still there. She stood in the doorway and let him look. He stood in the middle of the hidden room for a long time. He looked at the shelves, the cedar walls, the careful construction of a space built by someone who intended it to last and to hold what mattered. He said, "She built this herself?" Nora said she had hired someone for the construction, but she had designed it. She had directed every detail. He was quiet for a while. He said, "I didn't know her this way." Nora thought about what to say. She thought about the 40 years of Elsa Calloway making her Sunday dinners and tending her garden and going about the visible surface of her life with the dignity and the discipline she had always brought to everything, while holding inside her this other knowledge, this private accumulation, this long and patient plan. She said she didn't think their mother had wanted to be known this way, not because she was hiding it, but because it wasn't ready yet. It was still becoming what it needed to be. Richard nodded slowly. He looked at the cedar walls for a moment longer. Then he looked at Nora and said something she had not expected and would not forget. He said, "She knew which of us would find it. She always knew." Nora held his gaze. She said yes. She did. He stayed for lunch. They sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that were not the estate and not the legal challenge and not the past year's accumulated tension, but about their mother, about memories from the house on Meredith Street, about the way Elsa had moved through the world with the particular quiet authority of someone who understood what was important and was not confused about it. Richard told a story about a trip he had taken as a child when their father was still alive, a story Nora had not heard before, and the telling of it had the quality of something long kept and finally given air. Sandra did not come to the farmhouse. She sent a letter in May, handwritten, which was not her usual mode of communication and which therefore announced itself as something different. She wrote about their mother with a clarity and a tenderness that Nora recognized as the version of Sandra that existed beneath the professional armor, the version that occasionally surfaced in unguarded moments, and then withdrew again behind the competent exterior. She wrote that she was glad the farmhouse existed, that she was glad it had gone to Nora, that she hoped, going forward, they could find a way back to something that felt like family. She signed it with her name, just her name, without the professional title she sometimes included unconsciously even in personal correspondence. Nora wrote back. She said she hoped that too. She meant it the way she meant most things. Steadily, without certainty, but without closing the door. On a Saturday morning in June, Nora drove to the cemetery where Elsa Calloway was buried. She had been once since the funeral, in March, briefly, on her way somewhere else. The visit abbreviated by weather and the particular tightness of that period when the legal situation was still unresolved and everything had a provisional quality. Now she went properly, in the morning, with the summer light already full and generous across the headstones, the smell of cut grass in the air, the sky a specific shade of blue that she associated with the particular mercy of seasons that keep their promises. She brought nothing. She had considered flowers, which her mother had grown and tended and known better than almost anyone, and decided against them. What she brought instead was simply herself, and what she had become in the 10 months since she had stood at the gate of the old Hessler farmhouse on an October morning with $43 and a letter she had read so many times she could recite it without looking. She stood at the grave for a while. The light fell across the stone in the way light falls across things in June, straightforwardly, without the oblique drama of autumn or the thin uncertainty of winter, just direct and present and generous. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had been thinking about it for weeks and had not yet arrived at words that seemed adequate to what she was trying to carry. She thought about the room behind the false wall. She thought about 50 years of quiet attention and patient accumulation, about a woman who had gone to the hardware store and the notary's office and the estate sales and the small auction houses and the correspondence with dealers and had built, in total invisibility, something extraordinary, and who had never once said a word about it to anyone who might have been listening for the wrong reasons. She thought about what it cost her mother to hold all of it alone. Not the money, not the secrecy, but the knowledge that what she was doing was right and the inability, for all those years, to say so to anyone who could confirm it. To live with a truth that only you are aware of, for 50 years, and trust that the moment of its confirmation will arrive before the chance to receive it has passed. That was the real weight of it. That was the thing that made Nora's throat tighten when she stood at the grave in the June light. Not the paintings or the coins or the number on the appraisal, but the image of her mother going about her life with all of this inside her, patient and certain, alone with it, loving her youngest daughter from a distance that was also a calculation and a gift. She thought about her own years of showing up, of the nights in the kitchen and the appointments, and the third step from the top of the staircase that creaked. And then she thought about the Tuesday afternoon phone call from Harold Pettigrew, and the way the world had rearranged itself in 11 minutes, and the way that rearrangement had not felt like luck, but like the arrival of something that had always been in motion. She said, "I found it," quietly, to the stone and the summer morning and wherever the person behind the words of those letters actually existed now, if existence was the right word for it. She said, "You were right about everything." She stood there for a while longer, feeling the warmth of the June sun on her shoulders, watching a sparrow move along the top of a nearby stone with the focused purposefulness of a small creature with somewhere to be. The morning went on around her, the birds in the trees at the cemetery's edge, the distant sound of traffic, the particular aliveness of a summer day that takes nothing personally and offers itself without condition to everyone standing in it. She said, "I planted the garden." She thought about the east garden along the south-facing wall of the farmhouse, the herbs and the perennials she had put in during April, the things that would not produce their full effect until next summer, but whose presence in the ground already changed the look of the space, already announced what was coming. Her mother would have known, looking at it, exactly what it was going to be. She said, "The children are good. Maya is going to be somebody extraordinary. I think you knew that already. Lucas is going to be kind in the way that matters, the lasting kind. I think you knew that too." The sparrow was gone. The sun moved through a brief passage of cloud and returned. She had been here long enough that the ordinary rhythms of the morning had absorbed her presence and were continuing around her as though she belonged, which was the feeling she had come for. She said, "I'm going to keep paying attention, the way you did. I'm going to keep looking at the things nobody thinks are worth looking at and believing that what's overlooked is often what matters most. I'm going to teach Maya and Lucas to do the same. That's the real inheritance. Not the painting, not the coins. That." She stood there for a moment more. Then she said, "Thank you." She did not try to make it larger than those two words, because those two words were already carrying everything, and she knew it. She drove home through the summer countryside, the windows down, the road familiar in the way things become familiar when you have chosen them. She had driven this road in every season. In October fog, in November rain, in the sharp cold of December mornings when the fields were frost-white. She had driven it in the tired gray of February, the uncertain thaw of March, the cautious warmth of April, and now in June with the summer at full volume around her. Each season had taught her something about the road and about what she was driving toward. The farmhouse was visible from the road now in a different way than it had been in October. It had always been technically visible. The roof and upper story had been visible above the oak canopy, even in its ruined state. But what you saw then was a thing to register and pass. Now what you saw was a destination. The restored clapboard caught the summer light in a way that made the building seem to stand forward from the landscape rather than recede into it. The oaks, in their full summer green, framed rather than obscured. The path from the gate, graveled and clear, with the young garden plants beginning to establish themselves on either side, announced itself as a path you were meant to take rather than one you were meant to avoid. She parked at the gate and got out and stood for a moment where she had stood in October, facing the same building, the same distance from the porch. The gate swung cleanly when she lifted the latch, both hinges repaired, the mechanism functioning as something you moved through rather than something you negotiated with. She left it open the way she had taken to leaving it open in summer, because closed gates were for property that needed protecting from the outside, and she no longer thought about the farmhouse that way. It was open to the road. It was visible. It was a place people were welcome to see and sometimes to enter, because a house that has been through what this one had been through deserved to be known. She walked the path slowly. The gravel was even and well-dressed, a small thing that she had insisted on getting right, because she had walked this path in October. Through knee-high weeds with her breath rising in the cold, and she had promised herself, in the way you promise yourself small specific things when larger things feel unmanageable, that the path would be clear. That whoever came to this house would walk to it on clear ground. That the approach would be as honest and open as what lay at the end of it. She stood on the porch for a moment before going in. She looked out across the 11 acres beyond the house, the least 4 acres to the east showing their summer rows, green and ordered and purposeful. The remaining acres in the mixed state of meadow and managed grass she had decided to maintain rather than develop, because good land did not always need to be used in the most obvious way, and because her mother had believed in it as it was, and she was not in a hurry to second-guess her mother's beliefs. The meaning of it was not in the money. She had known this from the first night on the kitchen floor with the sandwiches and the hot chocolate and the wooden animals in a row along the baseboard. The money was real and specific and life-altering in the ways that money is life-altering when its presence changes what is possible. The children's school, the debts addressed, the farmhouse restored, the path cleared. These were not small things, and she did not pretend they were. but they were consequences of the meaning, not the meaning itself. The meaning was Elsa Calloway going to the notary's office in the next county on a Thursday afternoon 4 years before she died and signing documents she would not live to see completed, trusting that what she had built and what she had left would find each other in the right order, at the right time, in the right hands. The meaning was the particular kind of love that expresses itself through arrangement rather than declaration, through patience rather than display, through the long work of preparing something for someone who does not yet know they will need it. The farmhouse was visible from the road now. It had always been visible from the road, but in October it had been visible as a thing you looked past, a ruin half hidden by oak trees that needed no further investigation. Now it was visible as a thing you looked at, a farmhouse on 11 acres of good land, its clapboard the color of birch interiors, its windows catching the June light, its path from the gate graveled and clear and flanked by the beginning of a garden that had committed fully to what it intended to become. She parked at the gate and got out and looked at it for a moment the way she had looked at it in October, standing in approximately the same place on the road, with the gate in front of her. The difference between the 2 mornings was not primarily the state of the building. The building had changed, but that was not what she was aware of most. What she was aware of was that she was no longer standing at the threshold of a question she could not answer. She was standing at the entrance to a place she knew, a place she had walked in every season now, had cleared and fixed and lit from the inside and learned the sounds of in the dark. A place her mother had held for 50 years against the possibility that the right person would need it, and had been correct in her belief that they eventually would. She opened the gate. It swung cleanly now, both hinges replaced, the latch repaired, the whole mechanism functioning as something you went through rather than something you negotiated. She walked the path to the porch, the gravel quiet under her feet. From inside, she could hear Lucas talking. The low, earnest tone he used when he was explaining something important to Victor the elephant, the carved figure he treated as a confidant worthy of full information. She stopped on the porch for a moment to listen, but she could not make out the words. Only the certainty of them, the complete seriousness with which he was delivering whatever he had to say. She opened the front door and went inside. The farmhouse received her the way it received everyone now, with the ease of a place that has been inhabited long enough to have adjusted to the people in it. The sounds of her children moved through the rooms. The June light came through the restored windows in the straightforward way of summer light. The garden outside the kitchen window held its rows of young plants with the patient intention of things still becoming what they would eventually be. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at Gerald Briggs's table, which was still there and which she had decided would remain, because it was the table they had first eaten at in this house, sitting on the floor with their sandwiches and the hot chocolate on the gas stove and Lucas's wooden animals in a row along the baseboard. And some things earned their permanence through what happened at them rather than what they cost. She put the kettle on. This was the beginning. Not the discovery, not the auction, not the legal resolution, not the number on the appraisal document. Those were chapters in a beginning. The beginning itself was this. The kettle on the stove of a farmhouse her mother had held for 50 years on the specific faith that it would be needed, and the sound of her children somewhere in the building, and the certainty quiet and without performance, the kind of certainty that does not need to announce itself that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had inherited the ruin. She had cleared the path and fixed the heat and opened the wall. She had found what her mother placed there and followed it to wherever it led. She had stood at the gate in October with the fog on the ground and everything against her, and she had opened the gate anyway, which was all any of it had ever required. Just the opening of the gate. The kettle began to sound. She reached for 2 mugs, because Maya would want tea when she heard the kettle, and that was something she knew. About her daughter in the particular way you know the things that have become true rather than the things you had to learn. The oak trees outside the window held their summer leaves. The fields beyond them were tended and green. And somewhere beneath the good land her mother had believed in for 50 years, the last secrets were already dissolving back into the earth, their work finished, their purpose complete. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.